Socrates once said, "The one thing I know most clearly in my life is that I know nothing at all." From the East, Confucius likewise affirmed, "To know that you know, and to know that you do not know, that is true knowledge." Scholar Third Jiang Nguyen Dai Can's asterisk introduction to Eastern philosophy opens a door to a tradition of thought vastly different from the trajectory of Western philosophy. While the West is accustomed to dualistic analysis, the East leans towards an all-encompassing, fluid monism. This book doesn't stop at comparing the two ideological systems. It's a journey of revelation, compelling readers to reevaluate their entire system of values, which they once considered self-evident. Nguyen Dai Can doesn't present his arguments in a dry, rigid system, but with a deeply experiential voice, at once incisive and evocative, transforming philosophy into a way of life, an attitude towards existence. If Eastern philosophy is not philosophy but Dao-learning, what led the wise sages of the East to choose expression through metaphor, paradox, and even silence? And might it be precisely within that incomprehensibility that we can find a deeper truth, the truth about how we think and live? Asterisk Chapter 1, On the Path to Eastern Philosophy. The first thing we must confront is the inherent obstacles within our own minds. From childhood, we've been accustomed to dualistic thinking. This opposes that good opposes evil, mind opposes matter, light opposes darkness. We view things through dividing lenses and instinctively believe that opposition is the sole essence of life. But to truly grasp the Eastern spirit, we need to shift that perspective. The East leans towards monism, towards an embracing totality where seemingly irreconcilable contradictions coexist within a single whole. Even the term philosophy that we commonly use is merely an import. Its origin traces back to the Greek word philosophia asterisk, which Eastern thinkers translated as trite, wisdom from the character chayat, to cleave. The image of a hand holding an axe signifies cutting and separating, a way of analytical thinking that dissects things to see their internal structure. The West favors this approach, accustomed to breaking things down for examination. However, this method doesn't accurately reflect the Eastern spirit, for our thought is inherently encompassing, refusing artificial divisions, unwilling to see only half a face of the truth. For us, it should be called Dao-learning. The Tao is not a rigid concept. It is both dynamic and static, light and dark, good and evil. It encompasses both heaven and earth, yin and yang. This perspective refuses to be bound by rigid analytical systems. It doesn't confine itself within a theoretical framework, but unfolds like an endless current, where all opposing aspects rely on each other and transform. This is why knowledgeable scholars assert that the East has no philosophy, only Dao-learning. It is in this distinction that the East-West divide becomes clear. From the time of Galileo and Descartes, the West delved deeper into dualistic thinking. Yet, as they ventured into atomic science, science itself began to draw them closer to the shores of metaphysics, which the East calls Dao-learning or esotericism. They began to see that principles once thought immutable in ancient Eastern texts resonated with the latest scientific discoveries. Within this comparison, I want to clarify two types of civilization: the civilization of quality and the civilization of quantity. The East gravitates towards quality, taking ultimate goodness as its ideal, meaning refinement, depth, completion. Modern Western civilization tends towards quantity, taking progress as its ultimate goal, meaning expansion, increased production. One side values refinement, the other values expansion. From the late 17th century with the mechanistic movement, the West surged outwards, seeking power to exploit and conquer. The East, meanwhile, steadfastly held to cultivating its inner self. When we compare, we see a paradox in this so-called era of progress. People lament the decline of the world, the coldness of human hearts, the decay of art, the fading of morality. This means quantity increases while quality diminishes. Is it truly progress, or merely an illusion? Looking back at ancient civilizations, despite their material poverty, all aspects of culture, ethics, and art aimed for ultimate goodness. External scarcity was compensated by inner abundance. Hence the reminder, do not hastily dismiss the East as backward, nor arrogantly assume the West monopolizes enlightenment. The truth is, both are like two surfaces of a single reality. If one side leans too far, the other becomes paralyzed, and all of humanity will decline. Therefore, what is needed is not to maintain division, but to move towards unity, like yin and yang. They oppose each other yet complement each other. Truth is not in exalting one extreme and denying the other, but in harmonizing both. East and West are truly stable only when they illuminate each other. One provides the power of action, the other the depth of contemplation, so that the human mind is not paralyzed at any extreme. In this view, the difference between East and West appears not merely as opposition, but as two complementary poles. The West is like an eager young man rushing into life, bursting with energy, craving conquest, wanting to go far to achieve much. The East, on the other hand, is like an elderly sage, contemplative, quiet, dedicating energy to inner perfection, to ethical foundations and dignity. If both sides know how to complement each other, the path of humanity will be promising. Lacking one, the other will be incomplete. A society that only knows material progress without moral support will sooner or later collapse. Conversely, a society that only knows how to dwell in morality but lacks the means of survival will also wither. To understand more clearly, we need to delve into the spiritual foundations of both sides. The West emphasizes the external world. They seek to exploit nature, master all things, transforming the world into a tool for themselves. The East turns inward, exploring the inner self, seeking balance within humanity itself. This difference creates an imbalance. One expands outward, the other delves inward. The West pursues quantity, while the East pursues quality. One expands, counts, measures, chases speed and increase. The other aims for perfection, meticulously refining every detail, seeking ultimate goodness in morality, ultimate beauty in art. This is not just a difference in method but in ideals. For this reason, the West prefers to dissect things, cutting them into separate components, placing them in distinct compartments. The East, however, leans towards a holistic view, where each thing can only be understood in relation to the whole. They call this Dan-chat, monism, meaning the unity within all differences. A leaf is not just a leaf. It is also a manifestation of the season, the climate, and the entire universe operating in a fleeting moment. In terms of thinking, the West is accustomed to a logic based on the principle of non-contradiction. If an affirmation is true, its negation must be false. The East is not constrained by a single logic. Multiple logics can coexist. Something can be both true and false depending on the perspective. It can be contradictory yet harmonious. They call this, Badan-hi, non-duality. Finally, in social life, the West reveres individual freedom. They see the individual as the center, the foundation. The East, however, emphasizes individual sacrifice for the collective, seeing the community as the foundation. The individual only has meaning when integrated into the whole. Both approaches carry their own dangers. Extreme individualism leads to selfishness. Extreme collectivism leads to oppression. Only by knowing how to harmonize can humanity maintain balance. All these comparisons are not meant to defend one side and negate the other. What I want to point out is that both need each other, like yin and yang. Yin cannot exist without yang. Yang would lose its meaning without yin. Only when these two poles meet and interact does life emerge, does a comprehensive Tao come into being. Therefore, looking back, we see that what the East and West have achieved are not two parallel paths, but two branches heading towards a single destination. Unification is inevitable. As long as humanity remains divided, we will remain imbalanced. Only when we understand that material progress needs the illumination of morality and spiritual perfection needs the support of material means, will we truly walk the right path. If we view it with a comprehensive mind, we will see that the dichotomy between East and West is merely a surface phenomenon. The deeper truth is that humanity needs both, just as a body needs two lungs to breathe. If one side stops, the whole body will suffocate. Eastern philosophy is not meant to reject Western philosophy, but to illuminate and complement it. Just as modern atomic science in the West, the deeper it delves, the closer it gets to the principles written in ancient Eastern texts thousands of years ago. When mathematician Vendras affirmed that atomic science leads us to the burning shores of metaphysics, we understand that science, ultimately, must return to meet Dao-learning. What seem to be opposites ultimately connect at one point, like a circle that, by continually moving forward, eventually returns to its starting point. The fundamental difference lies in the West building on dualism, separation, and classification. The East is consistent in its monism, viewing all things as different facets of the same reality. Therefore, when learning, do not impose the rigid divisions of philosophy onto the expansive view of Dao-learning. I have often emphasized that trite philosophy is about chayat, to cleave, analyze, cutting, and separating, while Dao is about thong, to connect, to be whole. It is en hat di quan kai, a single thread running through all things. Here, it's not about distorting truth to fit a conceptual framework, but about letting go of the framework to allow truth to emerge. The ordinary mind wants to force things to fit neatly into its theoretical framework. But a philosophical system in the Eastern sense is a consistency, a natural flow of life. From this, we return to the comparison of two types of civilization. Civilization of quantity, which takes increase, expansion, and growth as its ultimate goal, a product of modern Western civilization. And civilization of quality, which takes ultimate goodness as its ideal, the very soul of the East. The terms progress and ultimate goodness here must be understood in this opposing relationship. The so-called progress of the West is often merely an increase in quantity, not a qualitative transcendence. The so-called ultimate goodness of the East often remains internal, lacking the means to spread. When one side is excessively skewed, it inevitably creates imbalance. The West reached the pinnacle of science, but simultaneously became bogged down in moral crises, in wars, in the disintegration of spiritual values. The East maintained the stability of its moral foundations, but often found itself helpless before material survival needs, passive in the face of overwhelming mechanical power from outsiders. Both have flaws, and these flaws call for unity. I want to emphasize that unity is not a slogan, but an inevitable law. It is like yin and yang in the asterisk I Ching, opposite yet complementary. The yang extreme generates yin, the yin extreme generates yang in perpetual motion. They transform into each other. So why does humanity cling to a divided view? What is needed is an embracing attitude. One must be broad enough to embrace both, discerning enough to see the strengths and weaknesses of each, courageous enough to learn from others. If we only stand on one side, we will forever be crippled. Only by transcending division can humanity hope to move forward. Someone asked me why it is necessary to go to the trouble of analyzing the differences between East and West. Isn't it clear that for generations, both sides have gone their separate ways? But that question is precisely what needs answering. Because humanity today is living in a comprehensive crisis, a disease caused by imbalance. One side leans too much towards quantity, forgetting quality, the other leans too much towards quality, neglecting quantity. And the price we pay is a distortion in civilization. Consider the civilization of quantity in the modern West, which has brought undeniable progress. Steam engines, water power, electricity, wireless communication, atomic energy. All these change the world daily. But at the same time, this progress has led to wars, spiritual crises, and a breakdown of social morality. People chase convenience, but their souls become increasingly empty. Meanwhile, the civilization of quality in the East has preserved ultimate goodness and ultimate beauty in spiritual life, in morality, in art. But precisely because it focused too much on the inner self, it often found itself helpless before material needs, unable to resist the overwhelming mechanical power of outsiders. There were periods when we were passive, weak, simply because we lacked the material means to protect the spiritual values we held. So what I want to say is that both sides need to complement each other. No one can be complacent. The West cannot continue to believe that it alone holds the key to progress. The East also cannot simply assume that having morality and depth is enough. Standing alone, each side is crippled. Combined, both become whole. The clearest image I see is that of yin and yang, one, yang, strong, expressive, outward-facing, the other, yin, deep, quiet, inward-facing. Separated, both are dangerous. Combined, both create the harmonious operation of the universe. Similarly, East and West are two poles of human life. Only by applying the law of yin and yang can we find balance. And here, I want to affirm one more point: truth is never found entirely on one side. Everything is relative. If we absolutize any pole, it is self-destructive. Eastern philosophy has long stated that any truth that can be spoken is only a partial truth. Therefore, we need both the sharp analytical vision of the West and the comprehensive, unifying vision of the East. Only when both illuminate each other can humanity move closer to the truth. So the goal is not to choose one side and oppose the other, but to learn how to unite. When we speak of unity, it doesn't mean erasing differences. On the contrary, it is precisely in differences that complementarity arises. Just as in the I Ching asterisk, yin and yang never assimilate into one, but they transform into each other, relying on each other to exist. Difference is the condition for movement. Complementarity is the condition for existence. The world today, if seen with an encompassing eye, will realize that the future of humanity does not lie in one civilization triumphing, but in two civilizations knowing how to complement each other. Only then can humanity escape the vicious cycle of crisis. I want to emphasize further that if we stop at mere comparison, we remain on the outside. The true goal is to live within that spirit of unity, because philosophy is not just words and theories, it must become the Tao, the path of life. Eastern Dao-learning never stops at distinguishing right from wrong on paper. It compels people to engage, to practice, to live. I have said trite, philosophy is to chai it, analyze, cut apart, but Tao is to live, to permeate every action, every breath. Here, the distinction is not to win an argument, but to see the whole more clearly. In that light, we no longer see the east-west difference as a cut, but as two branches of a river. They diverge, winding along two banks, but then meet at the estuary. Similarly, if humanity today wants to escape spiritual crisis, it must learn this holistic perspective. The West cannot be allowed to rush indefinitely in its intoxication with progress, forgetting its moral foundations, nor can the East perpetually withdraw into the complacency of ultimate goodness without the means to survive. This integration is not an arbitrary choice, but a historical necessity. We see its signs everywhere. The West, after venturing too far into science, is now beginning to seek the spiritual values of the East: Zen, yoga, the I Ching asterisk, Laozhuang thought, Buddhism. Meanwhile, the East is also having to learn the scientific methods of the West to protect and sustain its own spiritual values. This is not coincidence. It is the inevitable movement of the era. And when this is clearly seen, we will understand that the path forward can be no other than the encompassing path. We must learn from each other's strengths, we must complement each other. The West needs the morality and tranquility of the East to escape spiritual crisis. The East needs the material strength and experimental spirit of the West to no longer be passive, to no longer be weak. That is the profound meaning of the unity I speak of. It is not a vague dream, but a law of life, a natural law like yin and yang. They cannot be eliminated, they can only complement each other, like day and night. If one is lost, life ceases. Similarly, East and West must coexist, illuminating each other, otherwise humanity will drive itself to destruction. I believe it is precisely from this perspective that the student of philosophy can truly embark on the path of Eastern philosophy, or, more accurately, the path of Dao-learning. Not to boast of knowledge, not to debate for victory, but to reclaim lost balance, to live a life truly in harmony with the cosmos and with oneself. Chapter 2, The Logic of the Unspoken. When we read the classical texts of the East, what often perplexes those accustomed to the explicit clarity of Western civilization is the writing style. There are no detailed explanations, no lengthy chains of evidence. Instead, there's a concise prose, often just a short, even obscure sentence. Yet, for generations, students have pondered them, finding an endless source of light within. Why is this so? The answer lies in the very nature of Eastern thought. It is comprehensive, always encompassing, and always contains contradictions. Things do not appear on a single flat surface. A statement can carry multiple layers of meaning, even contradictory ones. If we are only accustomed to clear, dualistic thinking, we will naturally find it uncomfortable, even deem it vague or obscure. But it is precisely within that vagueness that a profound evocative power is hidden. Therefore, the writing style and argumentation of the East are not to provide the reader with a ready-made conclusion, but to inspire. The essence is not what the book says, but what it evokes in our souls. Reading is to ignite sparks within, and what is important is not to grasp the words, but to be moved to action, to implementation. This is why Eastern learning leans towards evocation rather than explanation. They write concisely not because they lack reasoning, but because they want to compel us to exert effort. Every word, every sentence is an opening. The apparent lack of clarity is an invitation to delve deeper within. The obscurity of the words becomes a light for the inner self. If we only seek external clarity, we will miss the opportunity to dig deeper. But if we patiently listen, it is in that ambiguity that we will find our own resonance. This leads us to another principle, which the ancients called resonant correspondence. True knowledge does not just come from the outside in, it arises when there is a resonance, an external knock, and an internal reverberation. Only with sympathetic sound comes correspondence, only with sympathetic energy comes seeking. The book is just a starting point. The decisive factor is the response within our own soul. If we are not prepared within, if there is nothing resonant, then the external call is useless. But when there is resonance, a single word is enough to open up an entire sky. Eastern thinkers, therefore, emphasize sympathetic response, the application of correspondence. Learning is not passive reception, but an internal process of response. Like two strings on an instrument, when one vibrates, the other, if tuned to the same frequency, will naturally vibrate along. Knowledge is similar. When it meets the right resonance, it will vibrate the entire inner being. But this vibration is not always readily available. It requires a process. And that process, according to Eastern thought, consists of 3 stages in the evolution of consciousness. In the first stage, humanity lives in a state of unconscious harmony with the great totality. This is when natural and spiritual instincts are whole and undivided. In the second stage, humanity begins to separate, to rationalize. The ego opposes nature. The mind constructs distinctions and divisions. This is the brilliant era of dualism, of empirical science, of systematic learning like Confucianism. Humans find analytical power but simultaneously lose their primordial innocence. Then, in the final stage, humanity can transcend dualism, overcome divisions, and return to non-differentiation. This is the path of Taoism and Buddhism. There, reason is not rejected, but is elevated to a higher level, integrated with intuition. Mind and intellect are no longer opposed, but shine together in a holistic vision. When speaking of the 3 stages in the evolution of consciousness, we should not understand them as separate steps, but as overlapping circles, successive waves. They follow each other but also permeate each other. The first stage is unconscious harmony. Here, humans do not yet distinguish self from not self. They are not yet two. Children often exist in this state. They cry when hungry, laugh when happy, and know no separation between themselves and the world. The entire cosmos is like a mirror reflecting perfectly within them. This is the time of natural instinct, of spiritual essence, of an unblemished integration. The second stage unfolds when humans begin to develop self-awareness. From here, we enter the world of separation and rationalization. Dualism forms. We see ourselves as different from others, good as different from evil, mind as different from matter, activity as different from stillness. This is the brilliant stage of empirical science, where humans use analytical intellect to dissect the world. It is also the stage of Confucianism, where society is built on order, on clear distinctions. Ruler and minister, father and son, husband and wife, superior and inferior. Here, reason is light, but it is also what erects walls. However, the path doesn't stop there. The third stage is when humans seek to transcend dualism, overcoming oppositions to return to a view of non-differentiation. This is where Taoism and Buddhism shine. In Taoism, they speak of returning is the movement of the Tao. In Buddhism, they speak of non-dual Dharma gate, the gateway of the non-two. Here, reason is not denied but is placed in its proper position, no longer dominating but harmonizing with intuition. Humans are no longer trapped in distinctions, but see unity in myriad differences. Therefore, we say that dualism and monism do not exclude each other but complement each other. One is two is one. If there were only monism, humanity would remain in a state of naive innocence, not maturing. If there were only dualism, humanity would be bogged down in distinctions, in struggle. We need to pass through both to reach the threefold principle, triunity, where both are reconciled in a higher principle. Thus, the journey of consciousness can be tentatively called by three names: monism, dualism, triunity. Monism is the origin, where humans are one with the cosmos. Dualism is the intermediary, where the ego forms, creating distinctions and contradictions. Triunity is the ultimate goal, where the ego is transcended to return to the cosmos, but this time in self-awareness, in perfect comprehension. This is not merely a metaphysical theory, but a description of spiritual life. Everyone, from birth, goes through these three stages. Childhood is monistic, innocent, unconscious. Adulthood is dualistic, knowing distinction, knowing struggle, knowing conflict. And after experiencing life, humans can reach triunity, a letting go, an integration, a freedom. If we do not recognize these three stages, we will be confused. We might stop at dualism, thinking that distinction is the ultimate truth, or we might vaguely want to return to monism without understanding that it is only unconsciousness. The true goal is triunity, a conscious integration, a comprehension that transcends dualism. When we speak of triunity, many think it is merely a naming convention, but in reality, this is the pivotal key of Eastern thought, because in our view, there is never a halt at one extreme of any principle. Any principle, if pushed to its limit, will give rise to its opposite. And these two extremes, instead of annihilating each other, are harmonized by a third principle higher than both. Imagine monism as a calm river, not yet divided. Then, in dualism, that river splits into two parallel branches, sometimes opposing. Finally, both branches flow into the great sea, that is triunity. In the sea, there is no longer a distinction between branches, but this does not negate the former division. Rather, it embraces all, harmonizing them into a vast whole. This is the path of consciousness. One is two, two is one. Without monism, there would be no foundation for emergence. Without dualism, there would be no experience of opposition for consciousness to mature. Without triunity, dualism would become absolute, an endless struggle. In triunity, humans are no longer bound by distinctions, but do not return to the original unconscious state. This is what Taoism calls returning to the true self. Buddhism calls it non-duality. Unlike the innocence of a child, here it is the innocence of one who has weathered storms, known suffering, passed through separations, and now returns in clarity. Therefore, triunity is the highest stage of consciousness. It is not the negation of dualism, but the transcendence of dualism. It is also not a return to the original state of monism, but a new, higher level, a conscious integration. Looking at life, we see this clearly. Novices often easily fall into distinguishing right from wrong, good from evil. This is necessary, for without distinction, there is no standard. But if one stops there, one becomes dogmatic and stubborn. Only when entering triunity do we see that right can be hidden within wrong, wrong can contain the seed of right. Good can transform into evil, evil can transform into good. Everything depends on circumstances, time, and heart. Thus, what Eastern thought always emphasizes is complementarity. All opposing aspects need each other. A one-sided view only blinds us. Only the view that sees two sides in one and then knows how to place both in the harmonization of triunity is the right path. Westerners often complain that Eastern philosophy is obscure, lacking clarity. But in reality, what they call obscurity is precisely the path to totality. For if one stops at dualism, all truths are only partial. Only by knowing how to pass through triunity does one see that truth lies not at this extreme or that, but in the harmony of the whole. In other words, triunity is not just a stage of consciousness, but a living principle. It teaches us not to absolutize anything, but to always be open to complementarity. It teaches us that contradiction is inevitable, but precisely within that contradiction, harmony can arise. Once we understand the meaning of triunity, we will see that this is not just a metaphysical doctrine, but a way of life, a method of interacting with the world. Because life is never simple. It always contains contradictions, conflicts, and if we only know how to look through dualism, we will be drawn into an endless cycle of struggle. Let's take an example. In human relationships, when we face an injustice, dualism forces us to choose a side, either condemn or defend. But when we enter the triunity perspective, we will see that even within injustice there is a seed of justice, and within justice there is a risk of transforming into injustice. This view does not make us passive. On the contrary, it helps us act with broader clarity. We are no longer confined to one extreme, but know how to be flexible, how to adapt to the whole. Triunity in life is like breathing. Inhaling is one extreme, exhaling is another. But only when both are harmonized does life exist. If one only inhales without exhaling, or only exhales without inhaling, life will cease. What keeps these two extremes operating is the third principle, the invisible balance. That is the image of one is two is one. In Dao-learning, triunity appears everywhere. The I Ching speaks of yin and yang but always reminds us of the Tao that stands above both yin and yang. Buddhism speaks of form and emptiness but also affirms that form is emptiness is form, meaning there is no negation but transformation. Taoism says, the Tao gives birth to one gives birth to two gives birth to three, and three gives birth to all things. The three here is reconciliation, the bridge through which from two opposing extremes all myriad things arise. When we internalize this perspective, we will no longer cling to extremes. We will understand that all distinctions have only temporary value. Within a small scope, they are necessary. But in the holistic view, they must be relinquished. Because absolute truth cannot be trapped in a dualistic concept. This explains why Eastern classical texts are often concise, often seemingly obscure. For they are not meant to give us a ready-made formula, they only evoke, so that within us, a resonance arises. Only with sympathetic sound comes correspondence, only with sympathetic energy comes seeking. Reading is not reception, but awakening. And when the mind has passed through the three stages, from unconscious harmony, through rationalized separation, to transcending dualism, then a single word can awaken us. I emphasize that triunity is not a half-hearted compromise, but a complete integration. It is not a concession between two extremes, but a higher level where both extremes find their place. That is why we say dualism and monism complement each other. Lacking one, there would be no two. Lacking two, there would be no three. Lacking three, the whole would not be complete. In this view, the movement of consciousness is no longer a linear progression, but an upward spiral. We begin from innocent monism, pass through dualistic distinction, and then arrive at transcendent triunity. From there, we can return, but not to the old point, but to a higher, clearer level. If we delve deep into the movement of consciousness, we will see that triunity is not just an abstract doctrine, but the rhythm of life. Humans are born in monism unconscious harmony with nature. Growing up, we enter dualism knowing distinction, opposition, reasoning, and building order. Then, having experienced clashes, sufferings, and limitations, we learn to transcend dualism to reach triunity, where we see the one in the two, and the two in the one. Here, all contradictions have a place. Good and evil are no longer two absolute extremes, but two sides of a process. Mind and matter are no longer two opposing substances, but two manifestations of the same reality. Motion and stillness no longer negate each other but circulate and complement. That is the spirit of one is two is one. Therefore, when reading ancient texts, we find that Eastern masters often do not engage in lengthy arguments but simply cast out a sentence, an image, a symbol. Because they know that truth does not reside in words. Words only have evocative value. The essential thing is to awaken the resonant correspondence within the student's heart. If the mind is not ready, 1,000 words are useless. If the mind is ready, a single word is enough. This is why, in Dao-learning, silence often has more power than words. That silence is not emptiness, but a space for others to hear the reverberation in their own hearts. What we consider obscure is, in fact, a door opening to depth. Placed within the journey of consciousness, triunity becomes a standard for understanding the entire course of human history. Ancient civilizations largely lived in monism, close to nature, without division. Then, as society developed, laws and science emerged, and humanity entered dualism distinguishing, analyzing, opposing. And now, amidst crisis, we see the need to enter triunity reconciliation, encompassing transcendence. That is why the East, with its Dao-learning, holds value as a lamp illuminating our era. I want to emphasize that if we do not reach triunity, every truth we grasp is only partial. Every doctrine, every argument is just fragments. Only when we place them in the whole do we see their true meaning. And that hole only opens to those who know how to pass through the three stages: unconscious harmony, rationalized separation, and transcending dualism. Therefore, the student of Eastern philosophy must learn to see life with new eyes. Do not stop at distinction, nor vaguely wish to return to original unconsciousness. Go straight into triunity, where all contradictions are embraced, where the encompassing view becomes light. That is the essence of Eastern thought, not rejecting, not absolutizing, but encompassing. From here, we understand that the path of knowledge is not a path to accumulate theories, but a path to transform consciousness. It leads us from innocence to distinction, and then from distinction to transcendence. And only when we have traversed it completely do we truly enter the Tao. Chapter 3, The Triunity of Reality. Having traversed the paths of monism and dualism, we clearly see that opposition is never ultimate. If humanity stops at dualism, it will forever be trapped in division, unable to advance further. But if one knows how to look beyond, one will see another, higher principle that mediates and harmonizes two opposing extremes. This is triunity. This concept is not my own invention, but has been present in all Eastern metaphysical traditions. For a long time, the ancients sensed that the operation of the cosmos could not be governed by any single, isolated extreme. If there were only one side, it would inevitably lead to destruction. There must be a third, invisible, yet ever-present principle, maintaining the balance between the yin and yang poles. Uber Benat once said, "Two contradictory principles, one positive, one negative, are inherently co-equal, and if there is no supreme regulating principle, they will destroy each other." It is this third principle that ensures the uninterrupted transformation and creation of the universe. These words are a confirmation of the spirit that Eastern thinkers grasped millennia ago. Therefore, when simplifying systems of thought, we must be extremely cautious. There are two parallel currents. One is the monistic view, or more accurately, the dynamic triunity view, where opposition does not stand still, but is always harmonized and transformed. The other is the static dualistic view, where division is maintained, clearly delineated like a philosophical system. What is called Dao-learning is the spirit of dynamic monism/triunity. We see it clearly in Laozhuang thought and Mahayana Buddhism. There, all things are in motion, all opposing poles are complementary, nothing stands still. Conversely, what is called philosophy tends towards static dualism, as in Confucianism or Moism, which emphasize distinction, order, and clarity. This is precisely why researchers, if they do not distinguish very carefully, will easily fall into error. If one applies the dualistic framework to ideas belonging to Dao-learning, one will find them convoluted, obscure, lacking clarity. But in reality, that is merely an incompatibility of perspective. If one knows how to place them in the spirit of triunity, everything becomes clear. Eastern thought is deeply imbued with the view that real is illusory is real. Why? Because we are always haunted by impermanence. All things are never static. What exists will be lost. What is lost will exist again. In the real there is a seed of the illusory. In the illusory there is a shadow of the real. Therefore, it cannot be viewed with a rigid dualistic eye. It can only be understood when placed in the dynamic flow of triunity. This is why this thought often permeates many texts, though not always explicitly stated. It is not a closed doctrine, but a pervasive intuition, the intuition that in any opposition, there is always a harmonizing principle, a power behind it, ensuring the continuation of life. If we look at Laozhuang thought, we will clearly see the spirit of triunity in the Tao Te Ching asterisk. Laozi wrote, "The Tao gives birth to one gives birth to two gives birth to three, and three gives birth to all things." Here, what is important is not just the words but the unfolding of a principle. The three is the connection, the harmonization, the bridge from opposition to the birth of all myriad things. Without the three, opposition would cause the universe to collapse. Zhuangzi is similar. He always uses paradoxical images to show that all things have two sides. Existence contains non-existence, and non-existence is the root of existence. But instead of stopping at contradiction, he opens up a broader view. In opposition, there is always an overarching principle that embraces both. That is the rhythm of triunity. In Mahayana Buddhism, this spirit is even more evident. The Prajnaparamita Sutra says, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form." This is not a simple negation. It doesn't say that form is nothingness or that emptiness is void. It says that both are two sides of a single reality, and what harmonizes both is emptiness nature, the third principle that transcends distinction. Here, monism and dualism are transcended in a holistic view that is triunity. Compared to Confucianism, we see a difference. Confucianism builds society on clear orders: ruler-minister, father-son, husband-wife, elder-younger brother. That is the view of static dualism. What is emphasized is distinction, clarity, explicitness within that system. What is wrong is wrong. What is right is right. That society operates through clear separation. Moism is similar. Mozi advocated universal love and non-aggression, emphasizing practical principles and clear distinctions to solve problems. That, too, is a dualistic view, where division is considered the foundation for action. But in Dao-learning, we do not find such absolute distinction. Laozhuang and Buddhism both lean towards a different spirit, dynamic monism/triunity. Here, distinction is not denied but is not absolutized. Distinction is merely a stage that must eventually be reconciled in a higher principle. This is why we say Eastern thought has two parallel currents. One following static dualism, creating philosophical systems like Confucianism and Moism. The other following dynamic monism/triunity, creating Dao-learning systems like Laozhuang and Buddhism. And researchers, if they do not distinguish very carefully, will confuse them, applying the dualistic framework to ideas that inherently belong to triunity, thereby losing the core spirit. I want to reiterate that the view of real is illusory is real, is the very breath of this thought. Impermanence constantly reminds us that what exists today may become non-existent tomorrow. What is non-existent today may come into being tomorrow. Therefore, if we cling to only one extreme, we fall into illusion. Only when we know that existence, non-existence, and illusion are all part of a single movement, and only when there is a third harmonizing principle, do we touch upon the essence. This explains why, from Laozhuang to Buddhism, thought is always rich in paradox, rich in opposing images, not to cause confusion, but to evoke a view that transcends, to remind us that beyond dualism lies another horizon, triunity. What makes the triunity perspective unique is its dynamism. If it were merely a diagram, a rigid definition, it would transform into another type of static monism, no different from a closed system. But in the Dao-learning tradition, triunity is always a flow, an unceasing movement. Look at the yin-yang symbol of the asterisk I Ching asterisk. Within the extreme yin, there is a seed of yang. Within the extreme yang, there is a seed of yin. This movement never stops. But if one only speaks of yin and yang, it is easy to forget that there must be a third principle to prevent these two extremes from annihilating each other, that is the Tao. This is why Laozi said, "The Tao gives birth to one gives birth to two gives birth to three, and three gives birth to all things." The three here is not a number, but the name for the harmonizing principle. It is what ensures the uninterrupted creation and transformation of the universe. Meanwhile, the West leans towards a static dualistic view. From Descartes to Kant, the rational philosophical tradition is based on clear distinctions: mind and matter, subject and object, reason and sensation. They require clarity, transparency, decisive division. In their system, if a proposition is true, its negation must necessarily be false. If one extreme has value, the other loses value. This difference explains why Westerners often feel confused by Eastern texts. When they read the paradoxical words of Zhuangzi or the phrases, "form is emptiness," in Buddhism, they find a lack of logic, because the dualistic view does not allow two contradictory things to be simultaneously true. But in dynamic triunity, that is natural. It's important to remember that triunity is not a denial of logic, but a transcendence of dualistic logic. It posits that within the same phenomenon, two opposing sides can exist, and both are true in a broader context. What is important is the third principle, the harmonizing foundation that helps us see that opposition is not for annihilation, but for complementarity. Therefore, when comparing, we clearly see that Western dualism is a static analytical system emphasizing clarity, while Eastern triunity is a dynamic, encompassing principle emphasizing harmony. One seeks certainty by excluding contradictions, the other seeks totality by embracing contradictions. This is why a researcher of the East cannot simply apply dualistic methods. If one does, one will only find confusion. One must stand in the spirit of triunity to find clarity. Because in the real there is always the illusory. In the illusory there is always the real. And what harmonizes these two sides is the invisible principle that the ancients called the Tao. In other words, if there were only dualism, knowledge would stop at analysis, at opposition. But with triunity, knowledge becomes a living thing, a movement. It is not closed but opens up to encompass everything. When we bring triunity into human life, we fully grasp its depth. Because this perspective is not just to explain the universe, but to guide how humans live in the world. If we are only accustomed to dualistic thinking, we will always be trapped in opposition. We will believe there is an absolute right, an absolute wrong. We will think that good and evil are separated by an abyss. Light and darkness can never meet. But life experience tells us otherwise. For example, what we consider right today may become wrong tomorrow. An action we deem good today, in a different context, might lead to evil consequences. What is called justice, if rigidly applied, can sometimes turn into injustice. That is the limitation of static dualism. When we enter triunity, we no longer view life through absolute lenses. We understand that everything exists in a dynamic flow. Right and wrong only have meaning in context, at a given time. Good and evil transform into each other depending on how we act. And above all, there is a harmonizing principle that keeps everything in balance. This very principle teaches us tolerance, flexibility, and the art of listening. In Dao-learning, this has long been emphasized. Laozi spoke of wu * non-action, not doing nothing but not acting contrary to the harmony of the Tao. That is the triunity view, not denying action nor absolutizing it but placing it within the cosmic flow. Buddhism teaches the middle way, not falling into the extremes of sensual indulgence nor into the extremes of asceticism. That too is the spirit of triunity, the middle path, the path of harmonization. When applied to life, the triunity perspective helps people live more freely. We are no longer bound to an extreme. We know that each opposing pole has its value, and only when both are placed together do we see the whole. From there, we act not out of stubbornness, but out of clarity. This is why I say that without understanding triunity, all truths we grasp are mere fragments. Humans will forever argue, oppose, and dispute without seeing that both are looking at the same reality, just from different angles. Only with an encompassing view can we overcome superficiality. And this is true not only for philosophy, but for social life as well. A society based solely on dualism will inevitably polarize, divide, and engage in endless struggle. A society that knows how to live in the spirit of triunity will find balance between individual and collective, between freedom and order, between material progress and spiritual perfection. In other words, triunity is not a distant doctrine, but the living path of humanity. It shows that opposition is necessary, but only meaningful when harmonized. It shows that all extremes are dangerous, but within extremes, there is always the seed of the opposite. And it teaches us that truth is not found entirely on one side, but in the reconciliation of both. The triunity perspective also offers us a great lesson in humility, because if we only stand in dualism, we easily fall into the illusion that truth is in our hands, that the other side is wrong, heretical. But when we understand triunity, we realize that what we call truth is only one side. The other side, which we thought was wrong, also contains the seed of truth. Simply placed in a different context, it will shine brightly. From there, we reduce our stubbornness, we learn to listen. We understand that all distinctions have only temporary meaning. They are necessary, but not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is reconciliation in the whole. That is where all opposing poles find their place, no longer annihilating each other, but complementing each other. This perspective also helps us confront impermanence, for if we cling to one extreme, we will be bewildered when it changes. But when we know that within existence there is always a seed of non-existence, and within non-existence there is always a seed of existence, we will see change as natural. Instead of resisting, we go with it. That is the secret of peace. Therefore, triunity is not just a metaphysical concept, but a way to live amidst a life of many changes. It helps us understand that even in suffering there is a seed of happiness, and in happiness, the shadow of suffering is always hidden. It helps us see that victory and defeat, gain and loss, are never absolute. It teaches us to let go, to hold on, to walk with an open mind. In the Eastern tradition, this is always reiterated in many ways. When Laozi speaks of the Tao, he does not just mean a philosophical concept, but a flowing current that embraces both yin and yang. When Zhuangzi tells paradoxical stories, he does not intend to confuse, but to open our minds to a view that transcends distinction. When Buddhism teaches non-duality, it is also a reminder that one must reach triunity, where all contradictions are embraced in a holistic view. Therefore, to correctly understand the spirit of Dao-learning, we cannot stop at dualistic analysis. We must place ourselves within the dynamic triunity perspective. Only then will we see that contradiction is not a deadlock, but a gateway leading to totality. Once this is seen, the path of learning also changes. When reading a scripture, we no longer diligently ask if it is right or wrong, logical or illogical. We will ask what this sentence evokes in our hearts. When encountering a paradox, we no longer hastily dismiss it, but will listen to see what door it wants to open for us. Because in triunity, truth lies not in exclusion, but in evocation, in awakening. This is why I say that triunity is the core of Eastern thought. It explains why our texts are often concise, often obscure, yet live on. Because they do not offer a conclusion but open a door, and whoever has resonant correspondence will hear the call. Closing here, we can see that from monism to dualism, and then to triunity, the path of consciousness is also the path of humanity. And only by choosing that path can we truly understand what the Tao is. Chapter 4. The Unity of Knowing and Acting. To understand the core essence of Eastern thought, we must first enter what is called the principle of unity. For generations, masters have taught that the mind of one person is the mind of heaven and earth, the principle of one thing is the principle of all things. These words from Cheng Yi are not just a slogan, but a principle. The human mind is not separate from the mind of heaven and earth. The principle of one thing is the principle of all things. This also corresponds to the principle in Buddhism, where principle and phenomena are non-obstructing, meaning the metaphysical principle and concrete events are fundamentally one. The eternal is not separate from the temporal, the absolute does not oppose the relative. To see a speck of dust is to see the entire universe. To grasp one moment of thought is to grasp the operating Tao. Therefore, self-knowledge is essential. The ancients taught, without going out of the door, one can know the world. Without peeping through the window, one can see the Tao of heaven. This is not arrogance, but an affirmation that the vast universe already resides within our minds. We only need to turn inward, delve deep into ourselves, and we will understand. From this, we understand why, for the East, philosophy is never separated from life. In India, too, all doctrines must fit into life. A doctrine that does not lead to action, does not lead to transformation, is merely a play on words. And in that tradition, an extremely important principle arose, the unity of knowing and acting. Wang Yangming clearly stated, knowledge is action, and action is knowledge. Here, there is no longer a separation between knowing and doing. Knowledge that does not lead to action is not yet true knowledge. Action not based on knowledge is merely instinct. Knowing and acting are simultaneous. Knowing and acting are mutually dependent. To explain further, he put forth 3 core propositions. First, there is never knowing without acting. What is called knowing without acting is only half knowing, a superficial, useless understanding. Second, knowing is the beginning of acting. Acting is the completion of knowing. To act, one must begin with knowing, but knowing only truly has value when it leads to action. Third, when knowing reaches genuine and profound earnestness, it is precisely action. When action reaches precision, it is precisely knowing. At their peak, both become one with no boundary. He further explained that knowing is the enlightened consciousness of the mind, meaning the perception and recognition of right and wrong. Acting is the activation of the mind, meaning the operation and movement stemming from that knowledge. These two cannot be separated. When our eyes see a beautiful flower, immediately a liking arises within us. When our nose smells a foul odor, immediately a dislike arises within us. In that instant, knowing and acting are simultaneous. If one claims to know something but not act, it is merely a pretense. The knowledge is not deep enough, not practical enough, and therefore has not transformed into action. But if the knowledge is truly genuine, it will spontaneously manifest as action. If Wang Yangming's three propositions indicate that knowing and acting are simultaneous, then a significant consequence inevitably arises. No nascent thought should ever be underestimated. For as soon as there is knowing, there is instantly action. If knowing is the perception within the mind, then action is its activation in that very moment. Therefore, he advocated for eradicating evil thoughts at the point of their activation, meaning to kill them at their inception. If a wicked thought is allowed to sprout, it will become an action. Once it becomes an action, it not only harms others, but also plants more unwholesome seeds in one's own mind. Here, Buddhism goes even further with the doctrine of a Vijnana storehouse consciousness. It is said that every thought upon arising transforms into a seed, bija, meaning a seed planted in that storehouse consciousness. That seed lies dormant but is not lost. When conditions are met, it will sprout and develop, transforming into mental karma and then into volitional karma. This means that even a fleeting thought leaves a deep imprint, and that imprint will await its day of fruition. Therefore, in Buddhism, practice is not just about guarding external actions, but also about guarding internal thoughts. The teaching of the masters is not to allow evil seeds the chance to be sown. If they have been sown, one must be vigilant so they do not meet conditions and sprout. Thus, the crucial thing is to prevent from the root. To make it easier for people to understand, some have borrowed a Western proverb: opportunity makes the thief. A fleeting greedy thought, if it encounters favorable circumstances, will turn into an act of theft. If there were no greedy thought at that moment, even if the opportunity presented itself, that person could not become a thief. This shows that the root of all actions lies in intention. Therefore, Wang Yangming definitively declared, the unity of knowing and acting is not an empty theory but a living principle. To know is to do, to see is to begin. In the very moment of recognizing good, we have begun to act virtuously. In the very moment of recognizing evil, if we do not quickly eradicate it, we have planted a seed of evil. Here, the spirit of Buddhism and Dao-learning meet. Both reject all mere argumentation, all useless erudition. What is needed is transformation in every moment, practice right from the inception of thought. If we observe carefully, we will see that in Buddhist teachings, all paths, all means lead to a single ultimate goal: the cessation of suffering. The Buddha never accepted a doctrine merely for debate, to impress, or to satisfy the intellect. He often refused to answer purely metaphysical questions, such as whether the universe has a beginning, or whether the soul exists eternally, not because he didn't know, but because those questions do not lead to liberation. They are irrelevant to the elimination of suffering. From this, we understand why the spirit of the unity of knowing and acting aligns so deeply with Buddhism. Because if knowing does not lead to acting, then that knowledge is useless. If knowing is only for arguing, to add a burden to the mind, then it contradicts the spirit of the Tao. Knowing must transform into acting, and acting must aim at the cessation of suffering. In the scriptures, the Buddha repeatedly reminded that if the teaching does not lead to the elimination of greed, hatred, and delusion, then it is not my Dharma. This means the sole criterion for evaluating knowledge is its practical utility, and that utility is nothing other than the transformation of suffering. When placed alongside Wang Yangming's thought, we see a remarkable correspondence. He said, knowledge is action, and action is knowledge. The Buddha said, to know suffering is suffering, then simultaneously the mind to end suffering has arisen. In both cases, knowing and doing are never separated. To know without doing is not yet to know. To do without knowing cannot lead to liberation. The reason why Buddhism rejects all empty metaphysical arguments lies precisely here. The Buddha knew that humans have a tendency to be enamored with theories but do not change their lives. A person can expound hundreds of sutras yet still be consumed by anger, still bound by greed. What good is such knowing? That knowing is merely a play on words. Therefore, Buddhism places emphasis on practice, seeing suffering, recognizing the cause of suffering, believing in the possibility of ending suffering, and following the path to end suffering. That is the Four Noble Truths. And in every step of that path, the unity of knowing and acting is the guiding principle. Looking back, we see that the convergence between Eastern Dao-learning and Buddhism is not accidental. Both originate from a need to transform knowledge into life. Knowing is not found in books but in every moment of awareness. Acting is not just external behavior, but begins from the innermost thought in the mind. Therefore, what is important is not to talk much about philosophy, but to live philosophy. Philosophy is not to boast of wisdom, but to become a better human being. And only when knowing and acting are one do, we truly enter the path of the Tao. One of the clearest practical consequences of the principle of the unity of knowing and acting is the emphasis on intention. Because, as stated, as soon as there is knowing, there is already action. An intention is not something to be overlooked. It is the seed, the root of all actions. Wang Yongming illustrated this with simple examples. Seeing a beautiful flower, we immediately like it. Smelling a foul odor, we immediately dislike it. Perception and activation occur simultaneously and cannot be separated. This means that knowing never remains in a static state. It always transforms into action. And therefore, any evil intention, as soon as it arises, must be stopped immediately. Otherwise, it will become action. Buddhism explains this further with the doctrine of seeds, bija, in the lay of Inanna. An intention, no matter how fleeting, plants a seed in that storehouse consciousness. That seed has not yet become an action, but it lies there awaiting opportune conditions. When conditions are met, it will sprout, giving rise to mental karma and then developing into volitional karma. Therefore, one cannot say that just thinking a little is fine. Because thinking a little has already sown a seed, and any seed sown will bear fruit. It is here that one fully understands the saying, kill it in the bud. It is not a metaphor but a maxim for life. Do not give evil intentions a chance to exist. It must be eliminated when it is still a young sprout that has not yet taken root. Otherwise, once it becomes a tree, all excuses, all reasoning will be helpless. To make it easier for people to perceive, there is a Western proverb: opportunity makes the thief. A person with a greedy intention, if circumstances are favorable, will become a thief. If there is no greedy intention in the heart, then even if the opportunity arises, it cannot turn into an act of theft. This saying clearly illustrates the process from intention to seed, and from there to karma. Thus, guarding the mind is not just guarding the surface, but guarding at the very root. What the unity of knowing and acting teaches us is to be vigilant with our smallest intentions, because in a single thought, there are already enough seeds for action. If knowing is truly knowing, it will lead to action. And if action does not originate from knowing, it will go astray. Eastern Dao-learning and Buddhism do not stop at words. Both prioritize practicality. Philosophy is not for entertainment, nor for boasting of knowledge. Philosophy, if separated from life, is useless. The most important thing is inner transformation, and that transformation begins with intention from what has been discussed. It can be seen that the principle of the unity of knowing and acting is the bridge between thought and life. It breaks down the dividing wall that centuries of rational philosophy inadvertently erected on one side, empty theories, on the other, real life. In the Eastern spirit, there is never philosophy if it does not transform into action. When Wang Yongming said, knowledge is action, action is knowledge, he was not just stating a philosophical proposition, he was emphasizing a way of life. A person who truly knows cannot but act. Their knowing itself is already an action. And conversely, when a person acts correctly, that very action is understanding. At the ultimate point, knowing and acting merge into each other, with no longer any boundary. Buddhism shares the same spirit. The Buddha never encouraged useless debates. What he wanted was the cessation of suffering, liberation. And to achieve that, knowing must become action. Understanding impermanence means that in that very understanding is already an act of letting go, of non-attachment. Understanding cause and effect means that in that very understanding is already an act of sowing good, avoiding evil. Here, knowing and acting do not follow each other, but are simultaneous. From the perspective of practice, this principle carries extremely important meaning. It compels us to be vigilant right from the intention, because, as seen, in the moment of knowing, there is already action. A fleeting bad thought, if not extinguished, will plant a seed in the lay of Inanna. That seed will await the day to develop into karma, leading to painful results. Therefore, what is most essential is to guard the mind not to wait until an action is wrong to regret it, but to kill it in the bud, to eradicate it while it is still a mere intention. From this, we understand why the ancients valued mindfulness so much. Mindfulness is not a passive attitude, but a holistic presence in every moment. Whenever thought arises, we know it. Knowing it, we choose whether to keep it or let it go. It is in that very moment that knowing and acting are united. And it is precisely here that we see that the unity of knowing and acting is not just an academic principle, but a path of moral cultivation, the foundation of the Eastern worldview. It teaches us that there is no division between theory and reality, between understanding and doing. To understand is to do is to understand. And the ultimate goal is nothing less than the transformation of suffering so that human beings live in harmony with the Tao. In other words, the unity of knowing and acting is a microcosm of the entire spirit of Eastern Dao-learning, not straying into empty theories, not getting lost in debate, but heading straight towards direct realization. There, knowledge is no longer a burden but becomes a living source of strength. And thanks to this, human beings can attain peace, freedom, and ultimately, liberation. Chapter 5. The evocative power of Eastern texts. Eastern thought from ancient times has been comprehensive, always encompassing, and often containing contradictions. Therefore, it cannot be fully expressed through the clear, definitive, one-sided writing style of the dualistic thinking familiar to Westerners. In the East, truth is not a straight line but a spiral, where seemingly opposing points illuminate each other. This is why ancient sages never presented the Tao as a rigid, fully proven system. Instead, they used symbolism, images, and concise phrases, often like shadows and whispers. The important thing is not what the book says, but what it evokes in the reader's mind. Those concise words are not meant to conceal, but to reveal, because truth cannot be simply handed over. It can only erupt when it meets a resonant correspondence in one's heart. Scholar once said, "The less clear, the better." This statement sounds paradoxical, but is precisely accurate when applied to Eastern classics. The less clear it is, the more room there is for the reader to delve deeper. The fewer proofs, the more room for the mind to operate. What Westerners perceive as obscurity here is, in fact, the vitality that makes such literature timeless. The ancients pointed out, only with sympathetic sound comes correspondence, only with sympathetic energy comes seeking. This means an external call is only valuable when it meets an internal response. If the mind is not ready, even clear teachings are useless. But when the mind is ready, even a vague hint is enough to illuminate an entire sky. Therefore, scriptures are often written concisely, sometimes like a mere brushstroke. This conciseness is not a deficiency, but is meant to compel the student to exert effort, to listen to the reverberations within their own heart. Many Westerners find reading such texts uncomfortable because they are accustomed to things being black or white, to systems logically argued, to a scientific method that only accepts analysis. So when they encounter an Eastern text, they find it vague, inconsistent. But they do not know that this very vagueness is intentional. It is not meant to confuse the reader, but to awaken curiosity, to unleash dormant intellectual potentials. Eastern classics are therefore often considered obscure by outsiders, but for those who know how to apply themselves, they are an inexhaustible treasure. Read once, not understood. Read 10 times, 100 times, each time a different resonance will be heard. Every word becomes a door, opening into previously unknown depths. Precisely because knowing and acting are always unified, the East never produced what is called a philosopher in the Western sense. A Western philosopher can live in an ivory tower, dedicating a lifetime to writing and debating, while their personal life remains separate from what they teach. But in the East, that cannot happen. People only respect the sage, hinjia, those who live their knowledge, transforming it into action. People only respect the poet, thai enhan, those souls who feel harmony with the cosmos, transforming contemplation into song. In that tradition, books are never separated from life. Teachings are not just to be read, but to be lived. Therefore, true learning is not found in speech, nor in writing, but in character, in conduct. This is why, throughout history, figures considered pillars of Eastern thought were not just writers, but also masters in practice. Confucius traveled everywhere, teaching through his exemplary life. Laozi left behind the Tao Te Ching as a short but boundless book. Shakyamuni Buddha renounced his golden palace to seek the path to end suffering. Once this spirit is understood, we see the special blend of emotion and reason in the classics. In the Vedas or Upanishads, there are passages that are both philosophical and poetic, simultaneously affirming metaphysical truths and humming like a song. In the Tao Te Ching asterisk, a single sentence can be a philosophical proposition, but also resonate like a concise poem. In the asterisk Nanhua Jing asterisk, Zhuangzi's whimsical stories are at once metaphors, ideological manifestos, and free verse. What Westerners call a lack of system, Easterners call naturalness. Because, in our eyes, emotion and reason blend naturally as one. Reason is not separated from emotion, and emotion does not obscure reason. They walk hand in hand, like two wings of a bird. This makes it even harder for Westerners to understand. They are accustomed to clear distinctions. Poetry is poetry, philosophy is philosophy, poets are ethereal, philosophers are cold. But here, both merge. A poet can be a philosopher can also be a poet. It is this unity that fully reflects the spirit of the unity of knowing and acting. To know is to live is to know. Reason and emotion flow from the same source. Therefore, when reading these classics, if one only seeks arguments, one will be disappointed. If one only seeks poetic inspiration, it is also not enough. One must read with both as if listening to a theory and as if enjoying a poem. Only then can one feel the beauty of the blend, only then can one see that in every small phrase, an entire universe is contained. The greatest difficulty for Westerners in approaching Eastern thought lies in their long-standing habit of dualistic, analytical thinking. This thinking demands that everything be clear, distinct, and differentiated to the utmost. In this way of thinking, right must exclude wrong, good must oppose evil, and existence cannot simultaneously be non-existence. This very mode of thinking helped them build precise science and systematic philosophy. But it is also what makes them feel vague when confronted with Eastern discourse. Even erudite scholars, fluent in sinology or Indology, often admit their helplessness. They read the Tao Te Ching and don't understand why a single sentence can simultaneously affirm and deny. They read the asterisk Nanhua Jing and don't understand why whimsical stories are considered philosophy. They read the Upanishads and don't understand why lyrical hymns are interspersed with metaphysical propositions. For them, it is a lack of coherence, a lack of system. But for the East, this very lack is its essence. Because the thought here is inherently flexible and dynamic, it refuses to be confined. It is crucial to emphasize that this flexibility is not arbitrary. It reflects a holistic view where all opposing poles are placed in a movement. If we imprison truth within rigid logical frameworks, we will lose it. Truth is like flowing water. It must flow, it must transform to maintain life. This is why Eastern classics often use imagery, metaphor, paradox ways of speaking that dualistic reason finds convoluted, but which help the reader open up to another depth. For Westerners, accustomed to delineating white from black, this attitude is indeed difficult to accept. They want a complete system, each proposition with clear arguments and definitive conclusions. Here, however, each phrase is like a suggestive brushstroke, with no ambition to encompass everything. Because the important thing is not to package truth completely, but to evoke it so that the reader finds truth within themselves. By comparison, analytical dualistic thought can be likened to a flashlight beam shining into every small corner, illuminating every detail. Meanwhile, the flexible, dynamic thought of the East is like moonlight spreading everywhere, not clearly illuminating every line, but encompassing the whole scene. Both approaches are necessary, but if there is only the flashlight, we lose the holistic view. If there is only moonlight, we lack detail. The difference lies in the East having long favored moonlight, while the West favors the flashlight. This is why there has always been a gap between the two. And it is also why Westerners often find Eastern classics obscure, while Easterners find them profound. A prominent feature of Eastern classics is their conciseness. Sometimes just a few lines, even a single short sentence, can contain a universe of meaning. Readers initially might feel disappointed. Why isn't it explained more? Why isn't it proven? Why isn't it elaborated upon as in Western philosophical systems? But it is precisely within this lack that there is intention. Because what is lacking on the surface is abundant in depth. The sages knew that if truth were displayed too much, it would become barren. The more one explains, the more one proves, the more effort one puts into arranging, the more easily truth turns into a lifeless corpse of words. But when it is left in a shadowy, vague form, it still retains its vitality, its ability to stir. The reader is compelled to delve deep within themselves to find meaning. And it is in that process that truth comes alive. This is the evocative method. The important thing is not what the book says, but what the book evokes. A vague sentence, a symbolic image, can ignite an endless stream of thought in the reader's mind, while a clear, complete theory sometimes merely closes all doors. The external obscurity, therefore, is not a weakness but a strength. It prevents the reader from being passive. It compels the reader to participate, to exert effort, to dialogue with themselves. Each rereading in a different context will reveal a different meaning. That is why Eastern classics have enduring vitality, never exhausted, like a piece of music. If a score writes out every note, every rhythm, leaving no room for the performer's freedom, it becomes rigid. But if the score has spaces, vague lingering notes, it is there that the performer is free to create, and the music becomes endless. Eastern classics are like this. Their lack is the space for the student's mind to speak. Therefore, when people criticize Eastern classics as difficult to understand, they miss the main point. That difficulty is an invitation. It is a soft bell chime for those with resonant correspondence to hear. It is not for easy reception, but for persistent contemplation. This is why seemingly short, vague words become doors opening to infinity. Reading the Tao Te Ching asterisk, each person will hear their own unique resonance. Reading the asterisk Nanhua Jing asterisk, each fictional story touches a different level of reality. Reading the Upanishads, the chants, both mystical and profound, lead us into a realm that is both poetic and philosophical. And so, the obscurity of Eastern classics does not diminish their value. On the contrary, it is their very vitality. For thanks to it, the classics are not confined, not imprisoned in one era. They can always resonate anew with every soul in every century. If there is one characteristic that makes Eastern classics incomparable to any Western philosophical system, it is the natural blending of emotion and reason. Reading the Vedas, we encounter passages praising deities with brilliant poetic language, interspersed with profound metaphysical propositions. Reading the Upanishads, we find a resonating chant that is simultaneously a philosophical reflection. Reading the Tao Te Ching asterisk, each phrase is both a koan and a concise, boundless poem. Reading the asterisk Nanhua Jing asterisk, Zhuangzi's wondrous stories make us smile and ponder deeply at the same time. Here, emotion and reason blend naturally as one. There is no clear division, no barrier between philosophy and poetry. Therefore, we can say that the East has no philosophers, only sages and poets. The sage is one who lives fully by the Tao, transforming knowledge into character. The poet is one who deeply feels the cosmos, transforming vibrations into song. In one person, both can meet, as in Confucius, Laozi, Shakyamuni Buddha, Zhuangzi. This very blending makes Eastern classics not just for reading but for living, not to know another system, but to change one's way of seeing, breathing, walking, being. A sentence in the Tao Te Ching can make a person abandon their official career and return to nature. A passage in the Upanishads can lead someone from sensual pleasure to the path of ascetic practice. A story in the asterisk Nanhua Jing can make someone burst into laughter and escape the shackles of ritual. This is precisely what Westerners, accustomed to analytical reasoning, often fail to grasp. They seek philosophy as a system of thought. But here, philosophy is life itself. Truth lies not on the page but in action, in lifestyle, in every breath. Therefore, what they call vague, obscure, lacking clarity is truly just because they do not perceive this blending. For Easterners, it is natural. Knowing and acting are unified. Emotion and reason are not separate. Reason guides emotion, emotion nourishes reason, and both merge into one, leading humanity into the flow of the Tao. The Eastern way of argumentation and symbolism is not a weakness but a strength. It allows the teaching to not die in formulas, but to live on for all ages. It makes the classics simultaneously philosophy and poetry, both rigorous and soaring. It transforms truth from dry propositions into an endless song of life. And it is precisely because of this that Eastern classics possess timeless appeal, capable of moving any soul that still holds within itself sympathetic resonance.